Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 6. My name is Sam Hoppen. I am your host for the show. If you have not watched before, first of all, welcome. This is where I'll be going through the key stats, trends, metrics, everything that I think are important to help lay a foundation for what happened this past weekend, what's been happening over the past couple weeks, and hopefully give you some information and insights into what you want to do for your leagues going forward. It may add a couple of DFS twists onto this as well. But before I get into the details, talking about all the players, I want to talk through the stats that I'll be walking through. From PFF is where I get all of the routes data. So any routes specific data or metric that I refer to is from there, like targets per out run. I also use their expected fantasy points, which is a model built that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage, the down, the distance, all that sort of stuff. And I use this primarily as a measure of usage for players to get an idea of how players are being used and if they're being used in high value opportunities. And then from the NFL play-by-play data, NFL Faster is where I get the bulk of the remaining stats that I have. So that's air yards, which is the distance the ball travels in the air before it gets to the receiver, weighted opportunity rating, I'll refer to as Whopper, which is a stat from Josh Hermsmeyer that weighs target share and air yards share for a player. Also have Racer, which is receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards and is a measure of a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. On the flip side, have Pacer, which is passer air conversion ratio, which is passing yards divided by passing air yards, and shows how well quarterbacks or their receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. Have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but weights it with interceptions and touchdowns. Pass rate over expectation, which shows how often teams are throwing it more than they would expect to, again, based on the down distance and several other metrics. CPOE, which is completion percentage over expectation, again, another model that was built to measure whether a pass would expect to be completed or not, and then the rate at which a quarterback is completing passes over expectation. And then lastly, have some stats that have been popularized by our friend Ben Gretsch, which include weighted targets per route run. This weights air yards and routes run with a scaler included to show players that are getting a high targets per out run, but are also being targeted down the field. And then also have high value touches, which are a running back specific metric. It is carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions. And any touch or carry within the 10-yard line is something I'll refer to as a green zone touch. On the show, I'll be going through stats position by position so I can compare against others in the position, help you make, like I said, start sit, waiver, or trade decisions in your league. And then I'll go more in depth through a couple team situations. Only have two to do today, a couple that stood out to me and some others that warranted some more attention. A couple final reminders: one, to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and two, become a member for just $5 a month to get early access to this show, to be watching it live, get to see how the sausage gets made in real time, get access to the Discord, and then a bunch of other benefits too. One quick shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who will be adding timestamps to the YouTube for each of the positions and the team conversation. So with that, got a lot to get to. So let's get right into it with the quarterback position. If you're watching on YouTube, and I hope that you are, I have just pulled up the quarterback chart for week 5. Actually, let's go back to weeks 1 through 5. And so this is showing adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis, touchdown rate on the y-axis, and then the size of a quarterback's bubble as his rushing yards per game. Primarily looking for efficiency here because quarterbacks can throw the ball a ton. For example, Trevor Lawrence, but not have a ton of efficiency and thus not be great options for fantasy football. So with each of these charts that I'll show throughout the show, I am going to show the 5-week rolling average for the first half of the conversation, and then halfway through we'll switch to a view from the last week of data. So that'll be week 5. But let's get into it. Going to start with Ryan Tannehill, who was drafted as a top 15 fantasy quarterback. He's currently outside the top 20 quarterbacks, right ahead of Baker Mayfield, who I'll be talking about a bit later. It obviously doesn't help that Julio Jones and A.J. Brown have been dealing with injuries. The Titans getting the full Julio Jones experience with that, unfortunately. But the Titans obviously seem very, very content on handing Derrick Henry the ball 500 plus times a game, it feels like. And Tannehill's been fine so far this year. He's got 250 yards per game, a 7.1 adjusted yards per attempt, but he only has a 3.5% touchdown rate, which is well below his 7.2% touchdown rate in the prior 2 seasons that he's been with the Titans. He's got a negative 0.3 CPOE, which isn't bad on top of a 0.88 pacer, but he's not hitting the ceiling that he did in the past. And again, I think the touchdown rate is certainly the big reason why that's the case, because again, the Titans want to run the ball as much as they can with Derrick Henry, and he was again a great fantasy option in the back because of his efficiency. So I think unless something drastic changes, and I don't really expect it to, even with Brown and Julio back, he's probably not someone you're holding on to at any point. It's time to cut bait if you were holding on to him. Certainly still a solid option in 2 quarterback leagues, but that's about it. Sam Darnold's the next quarterback to talk through here, and he took a bit of a dirt nap in the game against the Eagles. Sort of looked like his old Jets self, but he's actually been pretty good to start the season and is getting that wonderful post Adam Gase bump. Before this past week, he was the quarterback 5 on the season, primarily due to his rushing. He currently has 5 touchdowns on the year, and excuse Crosby is here in the room with me, so you might hear him shaking every once in a while throughout the broadcast. But back to Darnold, he's got 5 rushing touchdowns on the year, but only has 62 rushing yards on the season. So the boost from his rushing seems to be a bit of an aberration and not something that will continue. He's certainly been a better passer than he was during his time with the Jets. Before this year, he averaged about 213 passing yards per game. He's all the way up to 273 yards per game this season, which is a huge boost. The rushing, like I said, is really helping because he has as many passing touchdowns as he does interceptions on the season. His 1.6% CPOE is quite a bit improved over his negative 1.8% CPOE while he had with the Jets. And the Panthers have a pass rate over expectation of about 4%, which is a sign, I think, that they trust Darnold to throw the ball. But I think Darnold is still outside the top probably 15 quarterbacks for fantasy right now. He could be an okay bye-week replacement as we start to hit that time of year. His upcoming schedule includes matchups at home against the Vikings and then at the Giants and at the Falcons. So a solid chance for him and that passing group to put up some solid numbers. I'm going to switch the chart over to the week 5 because I had a question from, hopefully pronounces this, Jay Wyke in the Discord about Lance and Fields and just expounding on them. Unfortunately, looks like Trey Lance has a sprained leg. The 49ers have a bye in week 6, and it sounds like Jimmy G will be the starter when they return. It sounded like he was already pretty close to potentially playing in the game this past Sunday, but with the extra week, I think, again, Shanahan's going to roll with Garoppolo moving forward, which is a shame. Lance actually used, I'm not going to talk about him as a passer that much, but he used his legs a lot more. He rushed it 16 times. And according to Nate Yonke, who's an analyst over at PFF, he said that Lance became just the 6th quarterback to record that many carries in a game since 2006. And Lamar Jackson's done that 14 times, which is just absurd. And everyone else on the list has only done it once. So I think, again, the rushing is what helps both his floor and his ceiling. I think he had about 15 fantasy points this week, which, again, you see him on the very bottom left of this chart because he didn't have a touchdown pass, but again, was able to salvage his day with 89 rushing yards. But I'll talk about Fields a little bit more for a minute here. Unfortunately, I think he can be dropped in most leagues because Nagy really has no trust in his quarterback. And honestly, Fields hasn't really played spectacularly, if I'm being honest. He's thrown the ball 20, 17, and 20 times in the last 3 weeks. That's a total of 57 attempts over the last 3 weeks. I think Prescott had like 58 in the first week. So the other thing is that he's only run the ball 9 times total in each of the last 3 weeks. He's run it 3 times in each of the last 3 games. And that was supposed to be one of his big calling cards and could have really unlocked his value like it has for Trey Lance. And he's just not rushing the ball as much as we would have hoped. And his negative 9.8% CPOE is dead last in the league among quarterbacks with at least 50 attempts, which is not what you like to see at all. So better days hopefully ahead for Fields, but I'm not holding anything out for him. I think there are better options available. One quick note on a quarterback before I get to the running backs. Joe Burrow threw for a season high 38 attempts, and their pass rate over expectation is slowly creeping up. They only ran it 21 times in the crazy game against the Packers. They do play the Lions and Jets in 2 of their next 3 games, so we'll see if those pass rates hold through that stretch of games, but certainly an encouraging sign to see it go up as opposed to staying where it was, which was not the level that we want to see it at. Moving on to the running back position. On the x-axis of this chart, I'm showing rushing fantasy expected points. On the y-axis, showing receiving expected points. And then the size of the bubble is a player's FPO, which is fantasy points over expectation. And that is one of the signs I use as potential regression. If they have a massive bubble, that likely means that they are, and it does mean that they are outperforming the expectation fantasy point wise than they've been given. And if it's lower, then they've been underperforming, but have still gotten a hopefully large workload. So I'm going to start off with the Packers running backs. And I know I briefly talked about them last week as part of the team feature, but the way things turned out this week made me want to get more into this backfield. Obviously have Aaron Jones as the cover boy that I'm pointing to in the lovely thumbnail, but this entire season, I've been adamant that A.J. Dillon is just a handcuff and Aaron Jones is the primary back that they want to use. But this is the second game in a row with double-digit opportunities for A.J. Dillon. And after not being above 30% of snaps for each of the first 3 weeks, Dillon has been at 40% and 33% of snaps the last 2 weeks. I think most notably is that this was the first time, this past week in week 5, was the first time this year that Dillon had more high-value touches than Jones. He also had the only 2 green zone touches among the 2 running backs this week. Now, I don't think that this is a bad thing for Aaron Jones because, again, since the second week, he's averaging 20 and a half opportunities per game. He's still got 4 high-value touches of his own, like I mentioned, and he totaled 104 yards on just 13 carries with 89 yards coming after contact. It's also been 4 straight games for Jones in which he's run a route on at least 60% of dropbacks. He reached a season-high 73% route rate on Sunday, while Dillon has yet to run a route on more than 30% of dropbacks. Tom Silverstein reported after the game that LaFleur said that he left the stadium yesterday wishing he had given the ball to A.J. Dillon more than 12 times. He said his receiving talent has been evident and they feel confident in his skills in that aspect of the game. So the usage hasn't matched what LaFleur is saying, and that's obviously in the quote that he had. But I think this is almost like a Cowboys backfield light situation. I don't think Dillon is quite as good as Pollard, and I wouldn't be playing Dillon as a flex like I am with Pollard until we see more of this usage and more consistent usage, because it has only been happening for 2 weeks while it's been a little bit longer for Pollard. So certainly if you're in the A.J. Dillon camp, you're encouraged by this. And he's honestly probably their 3rd best player on offense, especially with MVS out on injured reserve. But yet to be determined. Aaron Jones, still a confident start. He's showing up here in the top right part of that chart where we want to see him. Moving on to another NFC North backfield, Dan Campbell is officially on my shit list. He goes out and says how he needs to get DeAndre Swift a bigger role, and he only has 2 more opportunities than Jamal Williams over the last 2 games, which is just ridiculous. And Swift is still running back 1 overall, not the running back overall 1, but a running back overall 1 because he's getting enough work. He's being efficient with it. But this guy, Swift, could be a top 3 to 5 running back if not for Jamal Williams. But this isn't a platform for me to complain, at least not all the time. Got to dig into the numbers to figure out what's going on here. And oddly enough, and this is what's frustrating, but Jamal Williams is averaging 10 more rushing yards per game than Swift. But what's kept Swift in such elite company is that he's averaging 30 more receiving yards per game for an average of 50 yards per game and twice as many receptions per game. Swift also has a 62% routes per dropback rate, which is in the top 5 among running backs, and Williams is down at just 23%, which is where the aforementioned A.J. Dillon is. He's below Damian Harris and right above Alex Collins. And this was after Williams was sort of seen as a passing down, I don't want to say specialist, but certainly a strength of his game. I guess it's good for Swift that he's been over 70% each the last 2 weeks after being below 65% the 2 weeks before that. But what is most frustrating is with the green zone touches, which is huge, and how those are getting split up. Except for week 5, Williams has had at least 1 green zone touch in every single game. He had 3 of them in week 4. So Swift only has 3 more green zone touches than Williams on the season. Despite that, Swift actually leads the league in high-value touches with an average of 7.2 per game, and he's had at least 5 in every game this season. Swift does have a 62% snap rate in the red zone, while Williams is at 36% in the red zone. Now, obviously, a player isn't going to get a touch every single time he gets a snap, but it sure is frustrating that it feels more like that for Williams than for Swift when they're getting about the same workload, but Williams is on in the game on fewer snaps. Then it certainly feels like every time that Williams is in, he gets a touch. I'm just realizing now that I've got a third NFC North backfield that I'm talking about here. And that third one is the Bears backfield, because this was our first week without David Montgomery. We saw some interesting usage in the Bears backfield this week. Damian Williams was the presumed starter, and what a lot of people thought was the biggest beneficiary of the Montgomery injury, and he had a fine game, but Khalil Herbert made a big dent in his workload. Williams played on 48% of snaps, while Herbert was at 53%, and Herbert only had one fewer opportunity at 18 than Williams did, with 19 all game. Fortunately, Williams was the only one of the two of them that got targeted. He got 3 targets, but Herbert, if you're doing the math, outcarried him 18-16. And I shared this yesterday, but here are the split of carries by each half. In the first half, Damian had 11 carries to 7 for Herbert. And then in the second half, Damian only had 5 to 11 for Herbert. And the Bears were actually leading for the majority of that game against the Raiders. And maybe it was a situation where they wanted to see what they had in Herbert. But one other thing I'll add, is that Williams had 3 green zone touches to just 1 for Herbert, and Williams ended up finding the end zone with a nice spin move on one of those opportunities. Herbert, I think, is most certainly worth an add because, like I mentioned before, Matt Nagy just wants to run the ball instead of putting it in the hands of his first-round quarterback. We got Nagy to start Fields, but having him actually throw the ball is apparently asking too much. But in any case, in the last 3 weeks that Fields has started, the Bears have a 40% neutral script pass rate and haven't thrown it, like I said, more than 20 times in a single game. They also have a negative 8% pass rate over expectation with Fields as the quarterback. And all told, this is a unique situation in which I'd consider starting both of them if I'm desperate, whether it's as a potential flex option or an RB2, again, with the buys. But their upcoming schedule is the Packers, the Bucks, and the 49ers. Definitely wouldn't play both of them against the Bucks, who have a bit of a pass funnel defense, but either of them you really could have value in those other 2 games against the Packers and 49ers. The last running back group I'm going to talk about are the Dolphins running backs. And this is a bit of a shit show. At least that's what some people might say, not me. But because I'm starting to think that Myles Gaskin is in fact the guy, and that week 4 was more the exception than the rule. After playing a season low 23% of snaps in week 4, he jumped up to a very nice 69% snap rate. However, his routes per dropback rate still hasn't eclipsed 55% in the game. He was at 52% on Sunday. Furthermore, after not getting a single green zone touch through the first 4 games, he racked up 3 green zone touches in week 5 and had a league-leading 12 high-value touches this past week. more encouraging for Gaskin is that he's had double-digit opportunities in every game this season except for Week 4. Again, I really think that Week 4 was just something that is not going to happen again, or at least not to that extent. Meanwhile, with the other two backs, neither Malcolm Brown nor Salvon Ahmed have recorded more than 9 opportunities in a single game. Granted, they're still taking away opportunities away from Gaskin to the tune of 7 opportunities per game for Brown and just over 6 opportunities per game for Ahmed. So, if Gaskin gets even half of those combined 13 per game, that's putting him near the 20 opportunity mark, which would be huge. But Gaskin has proven to be the best receiving back because, again, he has 5 targets in every game except Week 4. So where does this leave us? Brown and Ahmed, again, are both bench guys right now. Gaskin's probably a high-end running back 3 because he is the Dolphins' best receiving back, and they figure to be trailing quite a bit this season with how much their defense has regressed. And they too have one of the higher pass rate over expectations in the league. A couple other nuggets and quick hitters at the running back position before I move on to wide receivers. This is from Mike Clay. Josh Jacobs has been targeted 5 times in each of his past 2 games, and it's the first time in his NFL career that he's been targeted at least 5 times in 2 consecutive games. The Raiders situation is very messy, to say the least, at this point, so I don't really know what to make of this. But if he continues to see that receiving work, then he'll be set up to have a solid role. Trey Sermon played 2 snaps, two snaps in the 3 games that Elijah Mitchell has been active. Sermon's been a healthy scratch for 1 of them and has played 3 total snaps across the other 2. So I don't know why the 49ers traded up to get him, to use him like this. It makes 0 sense how they are using the players that they invested so much draft capital into. I mentioned earlier that Gaskin led the league in high value touches. Well, second place this week was Devontae Booker, who was tied with Austin Eckler for 8 on the week in relief of Saquon Barkley. I think with so many weapons depleted for the Giants, Booker is probably this week's top ad if he's available, even if Barkley is only out a couple of weeks. Actually, now that I think about it, Darrell Williams is probably the bigger ad because Clyde Edwards-Helaire is going to injured reserve. But Booker is certainly up there. I'm sure the guys will talk about that a little bit more tomorrow night. Tune in at 9:15 p.m. Eastern time to find out more. Last note here, Chuba Hubbard ran a route on 40% of dropbacks, which was up from his 20% dropback rate in Week 4. And in the past 2 weeks, while Christian McCaffrey's been out, Hubbard has earned a 79% running back touch share. So it looks like Carolina is comfortable treating him like Mike Davis from last year, sort of treating him as, again, the workhorse when Christian McCaffrey is out. I forgot to flip to the Week 5 running back chart here, but I guess a couple comments. Alexander Mattison is just as good from a fantasy perspective as Dalvin Cook is. Myles Gaskin, you can see, with the highest receiving expected points on the week, while Derrick Henry on the exact opposite, where part of the chart where we'd normally expect to see him did not record a single target this past week. Moving on, got the wide receivers up next. On the x-axis, we have weighted targets per route run, and then air yards market share on the y-axis, and then the size of the bubble is fantasy points over expectation per game. Going to start off with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And can we just marvel in the fact that the rest of maybe not marvel is the right word, but the fact that the rest of the NFL let the Buccaneers have Antonio Brown when they already had one of the best wide receiver duos in Chris Godwin's and Mike Evans. And the problem here, if there really is one, is that these three cannibalize each other's opportunities because of how good they are together. They're also one of the least concentrated passing attacks right now. They have the 9th lowest combined target share among the top 3 targeted players, but their pass rate over expectation is the highest in the league. So there are going to be games like Sunday where all 3 of them, or at least 2 of the 3, can hit. Obviously, Godwin didn't have a great game, but I think the point still holds. This is, as weird as it sounds, probably a 1A, a 1B, and a 1C situation, but it's so tough to delineate who's who in that scenario. But let's get into it anyway. Starting with Mike Evans here, he's leading the team in receiving expected points at right around 18 per game. He also leads the team in air yards share at 32%, target share at 20%, giving him a median 0.51 whopper on the season. And while the 32% air yard share is really good, you can see him on the chart sort of right in the middle here. He's averaging 127 air yards per game, and that is the 3rd highest rate in the league among all players. In fact, there are 22 wide receivers averaging over 100 air yards per game, and his teammate Antonio Brown is one of them at 102 air yards per game. I think I got to book that in for probably my best transition of the year so far. But Antonio Brown is leading the team in weighted targets per out run at 0.7. I think a big reason for that is that he's running a route on only 65% of dropbacks, which is significantly below Evans at 89%, below Godwin at 93%. I think this, along with the nearly 4 fantasy points over expectation per game average, are some signs for potential regression for Antonio Brown, but he's still been crushing it. I'd continue to start him where possible. Finally, Chris Godwin, probably the biggest disappointment because he's only scoring 16 PPR points per game, but that is the fewest of this trio. Like I said, he's got an outstanding 93% routes run rate. He's got an elite 0.97 racer and a solid 19% target share, which is second on the team. I think this is somewhat analogous to the Seahawks situation that I talked about last week, in that it'll be difficult to figure out which one to start in a DFS lineup, but all of them are startable in season-long leagues each week, or you could just start all 3 of them and hope they have a game like they had this past Sunday. That wouldn't have been a bad idea. Certainly better than riding the Leonard Fournette chalk, which I did not do. I'd like to formally note that. But anyway, that's my small victory lap for the week. Moving on to the Saints wide receivers, and I'm looking ahead on my notes, and apparently I am very fond of divisional bunches here because I'm talking about the Panthers receivers after this. But sticking with the Saints wide receivers first, throughout this season, I've mentioned that really nobody outside of Alvin Kamara is worth rostering on the Saints. Jameis is Jameis, though, and he can give receivers some boom weeks, and those 2 receivers being Deontay Harris and Marquez Callaway, both of whom have recorded multiple double-digit PPR fantasy point games so far this season. And those are the only 2 guys I'm going to talk about here, and are the only 2 worth even holding on to, because they both have 16 plus targets on the season, while no other Saints receiver has more than 9 total so far, which would be an average of fewer than 2 per game. So on the season, here's how things are shaping out. So first you look at Marquez Callaway. He's got a 30% air yard share, pretty good, an 18% target share, also good, and a 0.73 weighted targets per out run. Those are not bad marks, considering what you've gotten out of him, which is nearly 11 PPR points per game. And then you look at Deontay Harris, he's averaging 9.5 PPR points per game on his own. He's got a 24% air yard share, a 14% target share, along with a 0.71 weighted targets per route run. None of these would seem that bad, but then you realize that they're both averaging fewer than 4.5 targets per game, and each have a routes run rate below 60%. And these would be okay if the team was passing the ball as much as the Bucs, but they're not. These are wide receiver 3 numbers on any other team. The Saints have the fewest passing attempts on the season with 120, which is an average of 24 per game. That is not great. Their pass rate over expectation is near the bottom of the league, as you'd expect. So you can still roster these guys, and they might be an okay bye-week fill-in, but that's it. I'm not trusting either of them in a starting lineup unless I absolutely have to, and we're not going to get an end-of-half Hail Mary from Jameis Winston every week. So like I said, going to talk through the Panthers wide receivers. I stacked the Jets quarterback and wide receivers on stat chasing last week, and now I'm going to stack the Panthers. And let me start this off by talking about a crowd favorite, DJ Moore. I'm going to do what I did with Terry McLaurin last week and just share the stats that show how dominant of a season he's having so far. He's averaging 10 targets per game, 100 air yards per game for a 29% target share and a 36% air yard share. What's probably most impressive because of how many air yards he is averaging is that he's got a 0.87 racer, which again, that's an efficiency metric. He is just blowing that out of the water right now. His 0.67 weighted targets per out run leads the team, obviously, and as do his 93% routes run rate. He's also averaging just over 18 expected points per game. And finally, after having no more than 4 touchdowns in a single season in his career before, which is very well known at this point, he already has 3 touchdowns in 5 games. So knocking on wood here. Hopefully I don't jinx him, but it looks like he'll be crushing his touchdown total from years past. Getting to the other guys, it's really just between Robbie Anderson, who has clearly been one of the bigger disappointments on the season, and Terrace Marshall, the rookie wide receiver, who has shown some flashes, but has not been consistent whatsoever. Aside from the blasphemous 6 air yards in the Week 3 Thursday night football matchup, when everyone thought Robbie was dead in the water, he's had 90-plus air yards in every single game. He's also had 18 targets combined over the last 2 weeks, which is only 1 fewer than DJ Moore over that span. Additionally, after 2 straight weeks with a routes rate at 85% or below, Anderson's been at 90% plus for the last 2 weeks. So really, really encouraging stuff. And with a little bit more data under a belt, Anderson's average depth of target is leveled out at 15.2 yards. So we've seen a complete role swap between him and Moore from last year to this year. More what we expected to see last year, we're getting this year, and Anderson has that deep threat role. Now, that's obviously not good for his consistency, but hopefully he is able to connect with Darnold on some more deep shots throughout the year. Closing this out with Terrace Marshall, after his 6-target outing in Week 1, Marshall has not totaled more than 5 targets in a single game, and in 3 of the last 4 games, he only has 3 targets. So the good news is that Marshall has hit season high marks and routes rate being at 78% each of the past 2 weeks after not being over 68% in any week before that. Marshall seems like he is one of the primary slot guys right now. He's running 69% of his routes out of the slot, and that aligns pretty well with his 6.4 yard average depth of target. I mentioned last week that I'd still be holding on to Marshall and that I think he has a shot to break out in the second half of the season, but it's actually a lot worse than I thought. And Crosby's moaning here because he agrees, but Marshall is only averaging 4.7 PPR points per game and hasn't cracked double-digit fantasy points in a game yet this season. The last wide receiver group that I'm going to talk about are the Steelers. It was announced that Juju Smith-Schuster is out for the year with a shoulder injury. That leaves Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool as the top two guys, along with Najee Harris out of the backfield. I'm going to focus on those two receivers first because this was a request from Nez in the Discord. So yeah, I'll talk about Johnson and Claypool first, and then I'll talk about who I think steps up in Juju's absence. Johnson had a ridiculous stretch of targets in each game, and then had 2 targets on Sunday. Granted, he hauled one in for a long touchdown, so he didn't ruin your day fantasy-wise, but it's kind of ridiculous that it dropped down from double digits every week that he played this year to just 2. He still ran a route on 96% of dropbacks, which was his second highest rate on the season, but just didn't get targeted. He finished with only 39 total air yards, his lowest total of the season after 2 straight weeks of 130 plus air yards. And even with the 2 target game, he's still averaging over 9 targets per game. He has a 27% target share, which leads the team, but him and Claypool are neck and neck in a lot of categories. Metrics-wise, Claypool's been solid himself with a 23% target share, largely was boosted by his 15 target game in week 3, but they count all the same, and he leads the team in air yards share at 40%. And where they're nearly identical is with respect to Whopper and weighted targets per out run. So Claypool has a 0.6 Whopper. Johnson has a 0.62 Whopper. Claypool has a 0.69 weighted targets per out run, and Johnson has a 0.68 weighted targets per out run. So these two are pretty even, with I think Johnson having the slight edge because I think he may have more consistent volume, but Claypool each week is just a blow-up game waiting to happen. Moving on to the other receivers, Ray McCloud took most of the slot work from Juju after he left the game of Sunday, but I think James Washington might be the favorite to take over that role, despite being typecast as a deep threat. He was out in week 5, but before that had back-to-back games with a routes run rate of 80% or above, which is solid. He's also had 5 targets in each of the games that he's played. I don't really want to touch any of these receivers because the target share is so concentrated between Johnson, Claypool, and Najee that there really might not be room for a 4th or a 5th player in there to be relevant. Some other nuggets to wrap up the receiver section. We are officially on Jakobi Meyers touchdown watch. Jakobi Meyers now has 116 catches for nearly 1,400 career yards, and he still hasn't scored a touchdown. The guy leads the team in air yard share at 29% and target share at 24%, but he can't find the end zone. It's pretty ridiculous. He was so close this past week and got tackled at like the half-yard line, which is just a shame. A.J. Brown, his snap share did decline in his first game back And he did say he was on a snap count. He only played 64% of snaps, but more importantly, he ran a route, on 92% of dropbacks, which means they just took him out on a bunch of running plays. I doubt that continues moving forward because that would make it pretty obvious when the Titans are going to run or pass the ball, but it is encouraging nonetheless. Moving from one AFC South receiver to another, Laviska Shenault cashed the over 56.5 receiving yards prop with his gracious 50-yard reception, which is just amazing. But Ben Gretsch noted in his newsletter that Shenault played only 14% of his snaps from the slot after being in the slot at least 70% of the time in each of the first 4 weeks. Jamal Agnew ended up handling the slot role with 68% of his snaps from the slot. Would much prefer Shenault be there, but I think it's still to be determined if this is a big issue or if this is just a one-time thing. And finally, from Jack Miller, Keelan Cole played more snaps and ran more routes than Elijah Moore. This could have just been that Moore was being eased back in after missing a game with a concussion. So we'll have to hold out to see if that trend continues moving forward. Doing a really bad job of switching over the charts here. But the wide receivers for week 5, Davante Adams was Davante Adams. Kadarius Toney. I might have to talk about the Giants receivers next week, depending on how the injury situation for those players holds out. But he, despite not being the best draft prospect, at least in some people's eyes or some people's feet, he has made a lot of plays on the field for the Giants and has been very explosive. So worth an ad, certainly in your leagues. Now we have the tight ends, which is the same chart as the receivers, weighted targets per out run on the x-axis, air yards market share on the y-axis. The first of two guys I'm going to talk about is Mike Gesicki. And I'll admit that Gesicki caught my eye on this chart at the end of last week when I had a little bit more time to digest it. So wanted to make a point of it to talk about him this week because he's actually been really solid so far this year. You can see his bubble is right up here next to Kyle Pitts, Darren Waller, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, George Kittle. Like, that's elite company to be a part of. He has the third highest average depth of target on the Dolphins at 9.6 yards. He's averaging 6 targets per game. He has an 18% target share, which is third on the team, and his 24% air yards share is second on the team behind only Devontae Parker. His 0.53 weighted targets per out run is second on the team among players with at least 5 targets this season. And he has a 72% routes run rate, including a season high 77% route rate on Sunday. He's most certainly a top 12 tight end at this point. And with how much, like I said, I expect Miami to be passing. They have a 7% pass rate over expectation. I think he's going to be a really solid option moving forward. Unknown how long Parker might be out. Will Fuller continuing to struggle with injuries. So Gesicki is really coming into his own. The second tight end is Darren Waller. I gotten a question from Connor Trico out in the Discord about Waller's usage, which hasn't been as elite as we'd hoped over the past couple of weeks. He started off the season with a bang, getting 19 targets in the Raiders debut, and he's had 7 or 8 targets in every game since. But I think it's a bit of an overreaction to be concerned about Waller's usage. He's still running a route on 87% of dropbacks or more, in every game. He has only one game in which his snap percentage was below 92%. He's got a 24% air yard share, a 23% target share on the season, both extremely good for a tight end, especially in an offense, unlike the Saints that is passing the ball. 0.67 racer, also quite good. And he's only found the end zone twice this season, which is not great, but he has at least 4 receptions and 50 receiving yards in every game except this past week, which may be where some of the overreaction may be coming. And I think the reason he's not as prolific as in years past is because Henry Ruggs, Hunter Renfrow, and Bryan Edwards, all of whom have a 14% target share or higher, are actually getting involved. And while they haven't passed the ball quite as much lately, they're still, again, 7th in pass rate over expectation. Obviously, like I mentioned, the situation with Gruden leaving is a mess and may just have to adjust expectations on Waller not being a superstar, but just being a really, really good tight end option. But there are a few tight ends that I'm taking over him rest of season, if any. One note on another tight end in Logan Thomas's absence, Ricky Seals-Jones ran a route on 88% of dropbacks. He was tied for second on the team with 8 targets in the game. He's most certainly in the conversation for tight end streaming since Thomas is out at least another 2 weeks, but the team expects him to be out 4 weeks total. If you lost someone like George Kittle, then I think he's a perfect stopgap while he gets healthy, or even I believe Kyle Pitts is going to be on bye this upcoming week. So certainly a good replacement option. Wrapping up the show today with 2 team-by-team conversations. The first of which is with the Cleveland Browns. The Browns are led by Baker Mayfield. He's obviously not a starting fantasy quarterback, but there is a big spotlight on him because the Browns have a decision to make soon on whether to extend him or not. Next year will be the year he'll be on his 5th-year option. This season, he's had a solid 8.7 adjusted yards per attempt, which is above average, but only has a 2.8% touchdown rate, which is in the bottom third of the league. He's getting solid help from his receivers with a 0.96 pacer. He has a 3.8% CPOE, which is also above average, but I'll get a little deeper into that soon. He's averaging fewer than 15 fantasy points per game, so he's not in consideration again, except for 2 quarterback leagues as a starting quarterback. As far as the running backs, this is a split backfield. I mean, you see them on the chart neck to neck with each other as far as snap percentage and expected fantasy points per game. Nick Chubb has yet to play more than 60% of the team's snaps in a single game. He's been below 50% in 2 of 5 games, but that shouldn't be a surprise because it was and always will be a large part of the case against him. While Kareem Hunt is there and is involved, he's been in on 45% of the snaps this season with only 1 game below 40%. Like I said, they're nearly identical in terms of usage there. They're both averaging over 15 opportunities per game. Hunt has an advantage in high-value touches. He's averaging 1.5 more per game than Chubb is because he's basically getting all the passing work between the 2 running backs. In fact, Demetric Felton he has 35% of the running back receptions on the season compared to just 18% for Chubb, and Hunt is all the way up at 61%. Where Chubb has a slight edge is in the red zone, but he hasn't locked down that work quite yet. Chubb has 2 green zone touches per game, which is really good. He's got a 60% snap share in the red zone. But again, Hunt is at 1.2 green zone touches per game, and only a 36% snap rate in the red zone. These guys can hit their ceiling in a given week, but with each of them involved, I think they'll struggle to hit their season-long ceilings. The pass catchers. This section comes from my buddy Chris G, who wants to know why OBJ sucks, which is a good question. I'm going to do a similar but abbreviated bull and bear case for OBJ as I did for CEH last week, starting with the bear this time. So I did this a couple weeks with the Bills receivers, but I'm going to do it again with the Browns receivers. Baker Mayfield's completion percentage over expectation when targeting different players. Odell Beckham is last at negative 9.2%. Donovan Peoples-Jones first all the way up at nearly 27%. So the targets that Odell Beckham is getting are not quality targets. And to add to that, the Browns rank third worst in pass rate over expectation overall. They're third worst in red zone pass rate over expectation. Jarvis Landry has the chance to come off of injured reserve this week, and he will certainly see targets from OBJ when he returns. Overall, the passing attack is not concentrated whatsoever. They continually rank in the bottom of the league in terms of most spread out targets. But the bull case is that he leads the team in pretty much all stats. He's got 35% air yard share, 21% target share, 88% route rate, a healthy 0.6 weighted targets per route run. And he's also averaging negative 5.6 fantasy points over expectation per game, which is the second worst ahead of only Calvin Ridley. But I'd say that Ridley is the much better buy low at this point, just based on team level situation, pass rate, concentration of targets specifically. The only other guys to talk about right now are Rashard Higgins and Peoples-Jones, but neither are really worth rostering unless Landry is out an extended time and OBJ gets hurt. Each of them scored 11 PPR points at least this past week, but on the season, both have a whopper below 0.35, and that's not great at all, especially for a team that doesn't throw the ball much. Peoples-Jones has a 79% route rate on the season, while Higgins is at 65%. And David Njoku actually looks like the second best option to invest in for this passing attack, as he leads the team in weighted targets per route run at 0.66. Close that. He has a routes rate of 50%, which isn't great, but he's been efficient and has the second highest target share on the team at 16%, but he's nothing more than a tight end 2 right now, might even get traded before the trade deadline. The last conversation for today is the Arizona Cardinals, led by Kyler Murray. And what is there really to say about this guy? He's contending for a league MVP right now. He's leading the last remaining undefeated team. He's dropped down to the gasps quarterback 7 overall in fantasy so far, but you're still starting him. No doubt this might be your one buy low opportunity because he has fewer than 20 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games, but you'll still have to pay a pretty penny to get him. Talking about the running backs. So Chase Edmonds this past week entered the game as a game time decision, ended up playing what seemed like a full workload. He had a 61% snap share, which was right around pace for his season-long share, but he had a season-low 10 opportunities and season-low 4 targets. He also only ran a route on 52% of dropbacks, which was a season low. On the other side, James Conner has seen his snap share rise in each of the last 3 weeks, going from 37% in week 3 to a season high 48% in week 5. Did I say week 5 twice? But he's still a non-factor in the passing game. He's only got 4 targets on the season, but he now has double-digit opportunities in 4 of 5 games this season. I tweeted on Sunday after he scored the opening touchdown that Connor is becoming my least favorite vulture, and he continues to be just that, while Edmonds hasn't scored a touchdown yet on the season. But again, Connor's been dominating the red zone usage. He has 10 green zone touches on the year compared to just 4 for Edmonds. Connor's also outsnapping Edmonds in the red zone 54% to 37%. Right now, both of these guys are startable as flex plays, both of whom have some deep upside, but I think Edmonds has the higher floor with the amount of receptions that he gets. Max Williams, unfortunately, is out for the season. He was having a solid start. I think, if the Eagles are willing to trade Zach Ertz, maybe the Browns are willing to trade David Njoku, I think this would be a fine spot for either of them. But talking about the remaining pass catchers, this was requested by Pete, specifically wondering about Rondale Moore's usage. Let me tell you, things looked good in week 5. Moore hit a season high 60% routes run rate. And while I think a lot of people had hoped that those routes would come from AJ Green, they actually came from Christian Kirk, who ran a route on a season low 55% of dropbacks. And that was the first time that Moore outran Kirk in routes. AJ Green, meanwhile, has run a route on 89% of dropbacks this season. He doesn't have a rate below 83% in a single game this year. What I'm not sure is sustainable with Rondale Moore, I almost said DJ Moore, is that he has an absurd 3.86 racer because he only has a 6% air yard share. He's very much playing a Deebo Samuel type role from years past, where he gets a lot of short area targets. He's expected to make moves after the catch, which he can certainly do, but I think the hope is that he starts getting more targets downfield, because he had an amazing sideline grab on Sunday, one of the best catches in the last several years for sure. In other good news, though, Moore leads all the receivers on the Cardinals in weighted targets per out run at 0.53, which isn't a spectacular mark by any means, but the fact that it's higher than Nuke is saying something. Focusing a little bit more on the usage for some of the other receivers, though, AJ Green had just 2 targets on Sunday after starting the season with 4 straight games of exactly 6 targets in every game. He's actually last among the wide receiver group in weighted targets per out run at 0.4, but he's second on the team in target share at 16%, which is slightly ahead of the 15% that Christian Kirk and Rondale Moore have. And finally, with respect to Christian Kirk, he's the obvious guy that it looks like Moore is going to have to supplant. He's run 95% of his routes out of the slot, and Moore is at 78%. So clearly the two guys competing for that role. Kirk does lead the team in fantasy points over expectation per game at about 3 points per game. And after scoring 2 touchdowns in week 1, hasn't found the end zone since. He's second on the team in air yards share, but only has 0.37 Whopper to boot. I'd still hold on to all 4 of these receivers, especially with the way that Kyler is playing, but you might have to pick your spots on when to start them this year. All right. Another one in the books. How about that? That was fun. Couple reminders: subscribe to the YouTube, become a member of the Ship Chasing Discord for only $5 a month. Check out the show tomorrow night. The guys will be live at 9:15 Eastern time. As always, I will see you all next week, and have a great week 6.